The disappearance of a 16-year-old girl while out for a run led to a lengthy police investigation spanning 38 years. The revelation of the truth left the community in disbelief. Surprisingly, what could have been resolved within weeks ended up taking nearly 4 decades to uncover. Joyce McLean was born on September 4, 1963. Her family relocated to the small town of Millinocket, situated near the edge of the United States, when she was young. Music was her passion from a young age, and she excelled in playing various instruments, with the saxophone being her favorite. Not only was she a talented musician, but she was also an active member of the school music group, cheerleading team, and soccer team. As she approached her 17th birthday at the end of the summer vacation in 1980, Joyce had big plans to celebrate with friends and family at the lakeshore. She had recently obtained her driver's license and was eager to invite a local musical group to join the festivities. With 2 more grades to complete before heading off to college, Joyce was a dedicated student who excelled in academics, sports, and music. On the evening of August 8th, after spending the day at the lake with friends, Joyce went for a run to stay in shape for the upcoming soccer season. Despite not being a fan of running, she was determined to give her best on the field. However, that night, Joyce never returned home after her usual run around town. Concerned, her mother began searching for her, driving around and asking neighbors if they had seen her daughter, but Joyce was nowhere to be found. Given the tight-knit community of this quaint town, additional individuals joined the search as nightfall approached, yet the young girl remained missing. Concerned parents, in a state of distress, decided to involve the authorities. Local law enforcement promptly joined the search efforts, and as the night progressed, more and more citizens poured out onto the streets. They meticulously scoured the path Joyce had taken and the vicinity surrounding the school. Regrettably, there was no trace of Joyce to be found. With each passing moment, anxiety mounted, and the chances of locating Joyce safe and sound dwindled. As the night wore on, the police dismissed the notion that she might have ventured out with friends. The predicament lay in the fact that everyone she knew was at home and later participated in the search. Joyce's parents could not fathom their daughter venturing out alone late at night. Despite their best efforts, Joyce remained elusive, and the search persisted for 2 agonizing days. Throughout this time, law enforcement officers, alongside concerned residents, tirelessly scoured the area until they made the heart-wrenching discovery. On August 10th, Joyce's lifeless body was discovered a mere 60 yards from the school playgrounds, nestled among the trees. She lay on the ground, her attire mostly absent, with her hands bound behind her back by a strip of blue fabric. The authorities swiftly discerned that the victim had suffered severe head trauma, although a comprehensive examination was to be conducted by a medical professional. Following the autopsy, it was determined that Joyce had sustained multiple blows to the head, and her demise occurred on the very evening she vanished. Despite the absence of clothing, the unknown assailant refrained from any further harm. Regrettably, no additional clues were unearthed. There were no foreign DNA traces on the body, and even in the early 1980s, DNA technology was still in its nascent stages. It wasn't until 1987 that the first individual in history was apprehended thanks to DNA testing. The police were confronted with a convoluted investigation, armed with only a handful of clues. Following the grim discovery of Joyce's body, her clothes were found by officers, yet this revelation did not bring them any closer to solving the case. The news of the brutal murder swiftly spread throughout the town, casting a dark shadow over the community. Unaccustomed to such heinous crimes, the residents of this secluded town were in a state of shock. Compounding their distress was the lingering presence of the unidentified killer. With no concrete evidence to guide them, various theories circulated among the townsfolk. The prevailing belief was that Joyce's body was discovered near a spot frequented by less fortunate youths who engaged in illicit activities. Speculation arose that a group of intoxicated individuals may have assaulted Joyce, leading to a tragic outcome. Despite questioning locals who frequented these gatherings, the police could not establish any direct involvement. Another hypothesis suggested that the culprit could have been a transient worker seeking employment in the area. However, even after thorough investigation, no evidence linking the crime to a seasonal laborer was uncovered. Suspicion even fell upon the volunteer who stumbled upon Joyce's body. Although he had been surveying the area with a partner, he ventured out alone on the fateful morning. This raised doubts about his potential involvement, yet the authorities could not definitively prove his guilt. An alternative narrative emerged, revealing that on the same night Joyce vanished, a severe accident occurred nearby. A local teenager had stolen a gas tanker, resulting in a collision that left him in a coma for 9 days. His incapacitation thwarted the police's attempts to interrogate him, leaving this perplexing case shrouded in uncertainty. When he awoke, he maintained his innocence. The investigators were at a loss for the next steps to take. Lacking any evidence or witnesses, the case was put on hold for years, during which time law enforcement made no progress in finding a lead. Nearly a decade later, Joyce's family initiated a petition urging the coverage of their daughter's unsolved murder on a national crime show. This would help spread the word to viewers nationwide and potentially attract witnesses. There was always a chance that someone had heard or seen something, but chose not to come forward for various reasons. The petition garnered 6,000 signatures, prompting the show's producers to pursue the story. The episode aired in 1989, resulting in numerous tips being sent to the police. However, all the information gathered turned out to be inaccurate or completely false. Unfortunately, this is a common occurrence in many high-profile cases. People either make errors or deliberately provide false information, leading law enforcement to waste time and resources on fruitless investigations. The case remained at a standstill for several more years, but Joyce's mother never gave up her quest for the truth. In the mid-2000s, she believed that advancements in forensic technology and techniques could uncover overlooked evidence from the 1980s. However, there were obstacles to overcome, as authorities initially rejected her request to exhume the victim's body, citing the lack of preserved evidence after nearly 3 decades. Undeterred, the mother persisted, and in 2007 she managed to revive the issue. Dr. Peter Cummings, a forensic expert from Massachusetts, played a significant role in this endeavor. Despite being only 5 years old at the time of Joyce's murder, he vividly remembered the tragedy that had befallen his town. Dr. Cummings acknowledged that these events had inspired him to pursue a career in forensics and medicine. Upon discovering that the authorities had denied Joyce's mother's request for an exhumation, he reached out to her, encouraging her not to give up on the idea. Peter was of the opinion that the remains might still hold valuable evidence. He also sought the expertise of a renowned forensic specialist in the United States who took a keen interest in the case. Joyce's mother took the lead and arranged for an independent examination. The exhumation required a substantial sum of $20,000, which the family did not possess. However, they received support from compassionate individuals who remembered the case even after many years. With their assistance, the family swiftly gathered the required funds, and the exhumation was carried out in 2008. Surprisingly, experts did uncover significant evidence, although they chose to keep this information confidential at the time. Investigators simply stated that the discovery would not lead to an immediate arrest, but the case was promptly reopened by the police. Several months later, reports emerged that unidentified individuals had desecrated Joyce's grave. Authorities were uncertain if this act was related to the murder investigation. The next major development occurred in 2009, when law enforcement identified a prime suspect for the first time in 29 years. Reflecting back to 1980, shortly after Joyce's tragic death, a local man stole a gasoline truck and was involved in a severe accident, resulting in him falling into a coma. This individual was Scott Fournier, a 19-year-old at the time. In 2009, he faced charges related to illegal material involving minors. Initially, the two cases seemed unrelated, until the judge unexpectedly named Scott as a person of interest in the Joyce McLean murder case following his sentencing, urging him to confess. This revelation came as a shock to Joyce's family, who were familiar with Scott and knew that he had been a suspect due to the earlier accident. The reason behind the judge officially declaring him a person of interest after nearly 3 decades remains a mystery. The lead detective refrained from providing any comments on the matter, only mentioning that significant progress had been made since the exhumation and that the investigation was progressing well. Scott received a relatively light sentence of 6.5 years for possessing prohibited material despite his prior criminal record. Although he had been tried for theft in 1979, 1980, and 1984, those incidents were too far in the past to impact the current case. In 2001, he came to the attention of the police when his 6-year-old daughter accused him of molestation. Despite law enforcement's belief in the girl's story, the crime could not be substantiated, and Scott remained unpunished. These events alone could warrant serious consideration of him as a suspect in Joyce's murder. However, the situation is far more chilling than initially thought. The case dragged on for several more years while the man was incarcerated, with investigators keeping their findings confidential and interviewing potential witnesses. In 2015, a team of 10 men was assembled to revisit the location where Joyce's body was discovered. Although no details were disclosed at the conclusion of the search, everything fell into place a year later. On March 4, 2016, the police officially announced the arrest of the suspect. Scott Fournier, who had recently been released from prison, was apprehended and charged with Joyce McLean's murder. At 55 years old, Scott refused to plead guilty, leading to a trial that commenced in 2018. Due to a lack of funds, he spent nearly 2 years in jail awaiting his initial hearing. During the trial, it was revealed that Scott had confessed multiple times to killing Joyce shortly after the incident. On one occasion, he tearfully admitted to his mother and sister that he was responsible for Joyce's death. On other instances, he disclosed this information to a local priest, a couple's acquaintance, and a co-worker. Some of these revelations were only reported to the authorities years later, while others were immediately known. Scott was initially cooperative but later began to deny any involvement, attributing his confusion to a head injury sustained in an accident. He claimed to have believed he had killed Joyce, but now insists that it never occurred. Throughout 27 interrogations, Scott's narrative kept changing. Initially, he confessed to stabbing Joyce with a glass insulator from a nearby power line, but the murder weapon could not be definitively identified. Despite some inconsistencies, his account closely matched the actual events. Subsequent statements varied from claiming he acted alone to implicating others in the crime. The detectives faced challenges due to the evolving nature of Scott's story and lack of concrete evidence. It was only after years of investigation that sufficient proof was gathered to proceed with a trial, thanks to the testimonies of a priest and Scott's colleague who overheard his confession. The colleague inquired about how the guy managed to escape without consequences. Scott explained that he misled the police with false information about others' involvement, which diverted their attention. The colleague reported the conversation to superiors, but not to law enforcement. Surprisingly, the information was never relayed to the police. Scott confessed to the priest that he did not harm Joyce because she was menstruating at the time, a detail the police did not disclose. This revelation, discovered during the examination of the girl's body, raised suspicions as Scott could only have known this if he was the killer. Scott's lawyers argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial, attributing his confession to a head injury from an accident. They also pointed out that the police did not immediately arrest him after his initial confession. Furthermore, they criticized the court for not considering other potential suspects, such as Peter Larley, who discovered Joyce's body. Larley's behavior on the day of the murder raised doubts, especially since his sister witnessed him leaving the house early in the morning with a gym bag and returning home looking content after finding the body. The volunteer's delayed report to the police, 16 years later, adds to the suspicion. Unfortunately, Peter Larley passed away from a heart attack just 2 days before Scott's arrest. Due to this circumstance, the reasons behind his early emergence will forever remain unknown. Nevertheless, the authorities have stated that there is no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. The prosecution vehemently refuted all claims made by the defense attorneys, assuring the court that the police thoroughly investigated all potential suspects without finding any indication of their involvement. Conversely, Scott raised multiple red flags, with even his stepfather expressing suspicions to the police early on in the inquiry. He alleged that Scott had mentioned plans to go running in the evening shortly before the tragic incident, as well as expressing sympathy for the victim, Joyce. Furthermore, when Scott initially confessed to the crime, he accurately led investigators to the exact location where Joyce's body was discovered. Several witnesses were also cited to support the theory of his involvement. On the night of the murder, a couple reported seeing Scott running past the crime scene with a bottle of alcohol in hand around 9 p.m., accompanied by an unidentified young man. Although they were unaware at the time, this was where Joyce's body would later be found. Additionally, 2 local teenagers had witnessed Scott and another young male running through the area an hour and a half earlier. Following a trial lasting just over 2 weeks, Scott was ultimately convicted of Joyce's murder, receiving a 45-year prison sentence at the age of 57, effectively ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. In 2019, Scott's legal team filed an appeal, leading to a new hearing. However, the court upheld the original sentence, deeming the evidence against him to be overwhelming and dismissing all defense arguments as unsubstantial. Joyce's relatives were finally relieved of the burden of ignorance that had plagued them for nearly 4 decades. Throughout those years, they tirelessly sought the truth, with Joyce's mother leading the charge. Her unwavering dedication to seeking justice was unparalleled. In a remarkable turn of events, she not only achieved justice for her daughter, but also played a pivotal role in the passing of a law that allocated significant resources to the establishment of unsolved homicide units. However, a lingering question remains. Who was the mysterious individual spotted by witnesses? Scott's potential involvement appears glaringly evident, given his intimate knowledge of undisclosed police information. The consistency in the accounts provided by 2 separate groups of witnesses raises suspicions about the possibility of Scott acting in concert with another individual. Yet, the absence of any concrete evidence regarding a second perpetrator casts doubt on this theory. Following Joyce's tragic demise, Scott's involvement in a subsequent gasoline truck theft and subsequent accident raises further questions. Despite being the sole occupant of the vehicle during the crash, the whereabouts of his alleged accomplice remain unknown. Could they have parted ways immediately after the crime? The notion of a second killer remains shrouded in uncertainty. The disappearance of a young woman from her apartment, which she shared with her sister, remained a mystery for many years. Despite the efforts of the police, no clues were found, and the case went unsolved for over 5 decades. It was only after 53 years that the disturbing truth was finally uncovered, in a rather unconventional manner. Pamela Dorington, born on November 23, 1948, in the quaint American town of Helena, Montana, was raised in the warm embrace of a loving family and a circle of loyal friends. Recognized for her unwavering sense of responsibility from a tender age, she was always ready to lend a helping hand. An ardent animal lover, her parents gifted her with a majestic black Labrador, a companion she cherished dearly. Excelling in her studies at the local school, Pamela's passion for the Russian language blossomed during her high school years. Following graduation, she embarked on a career as a surgical nurse at St. Peter's Hospital, seeking to carve out her own path in the world. Eager to embrace independence, she moved into a charming 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a luxurious complex with her cousin Mary, who also worked at the hospital. As the sun rose on February 17, 1968, Mary set off for work, leaving Pamela in peaceful slumber, preparing for her evening shift. Meanwhile, Pamela's father, passing by the apartment complex, noticed the Labrador frolicking freely outside. Assuming his daughter was at work, he retrieved the dog and departed. However, as the day unfolded, Pamela failed to arrive at the hospital for her shift, causing concern to mount among her family and friends. As a responsible soul, Pamela's absence raised alarm bells, for she was not one to shirk her duties without just cause, nor would she vanish without a trace, leaving her loved ones in a state of distress. Another reason for concern arose when Pamela's vehicle was discovered in the parking lot of the luxury apartment complex. This detail further diminished the possibility of the young lady venturing out on foot. Throughout the day, her family anxiously awaited until the break of dawn before reaching out to the authorities. A missing persons report was promptly filed, although the detectives did not dismiss the notion that she may have left voluntarily. Upon examining her residence, investigators found no traces of forced entry or signs of a struggle. Everything appeared to be in order. They requested her sister to inspect Pamela's belongings and confirm if everything was accounted for. Mary observed that her coat, robe, purse, and winter boots were conspicuously absent from their apartment. 2 days following Pamela's mysterious disappearance, law enforcement orchestrated a thorough search operation spanning a 30-kilometer radius around her residence. Fields, forests, and bodies of water were meticulously combed through while volunteers and family members distributed flyers across the city streets. Police officers interviewed Pamela's neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances, all of whom claimed to have no recollection of seeing her on the day she vanished or any inkling of her whereabouts. Her supervisor at the hospital disclosed that Pamela was scheduled to collect a $200 check that day, but she failed to show up. This detail further suggested that the likelihood of her absconding with the money she had earned was slim. In the initial stages of the investigation, over 100 individuals associated with Pamela were questioned by the authorities, some of whom underwent polygraph tests, albeit yielding inconclusive results. Despite their exhaustive efforts, no evidence pointing towards her departure from the town was unearthed. Faced with a dearth of leads, the police intensified their search efforts, expanding the search area to approximately 50 kilometers around the city and deploying additional resources. Given the challenging terrain that impeded pedestrian and vehicular access to certain areas, the search operation involved a significant number of officers on horseback. Speaking to the press, the sheriff emphasized the superiority of utilizing a horseback rider in the search efforts due to enhanced visibility and the keen sense of smell possessed by animals. Despite a month-long search yielding inconclusive results, the sheriff made the difficult decision to halt the operation. Subsequently, the case has hit a dead end as detectives remain without any promising leads. However, in April, a peculiar incident unfolded in Great Falls, located approximately 140 kilometers from Helena. A patrolman pulled over a speeding vehicle and, upon inspecting the driver's license, discovered it belonged to Pamela Dorington. This unexpected development sparked renewed optimism among the missing woman's family. Unfortunately, the car and its driver could not be located by investigators. Nearly 4 months later, on June 13th, the sheriff's office received a crucial tip. A national park ranger stumbled upon a human body in the water near Helena. Upon retrieval, experts confirmed that the torso belonged to a young woman between 17 to 23 years old, suspected to be Pamela Dorington. The discovery of clothing items resembling those from Pamela's wardrobe further solidified this assumption. Tragically, the medical examination revealed multiple stab wounds and signs of abuse on the young woman's body. Nevertheless, the torso could not be identified on its own. This was all before the advent of DNA testing. The experts could only estimate the approximate duration the body had been submerged in the water. They believed it could have been around 4 months, coinciding with Pamela's disappearance. Despite extensive searches in the lake and the Missouri River, investigators and divers were unable to locate the missing body parts. The sheriff informed the media that the body likely belonged to Pamela, shifting the focus from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. However, the lack of leads meant that the perpetrator remained at large. A year later, the sheriff sought the expertise of a psychologist in Detroit who specialized in violent crimes. Based on the available information, the psychologist concluded that the murderer was a psychopath driven by twisted desires. This revelation suggested that the perpetrator might have committed more crimes and could easily conceal his true identity. Despite sharing the list of suspects with the psychologist, no concrete evidence was found to link any of them to the crime. Pamela's remains were not laid to rest until 1975, with the investigation yielding no further progress in capturing the culprit. Throughout the extensive investigation, authorities never discovered any additional remains of the victim, nor did they make any significant strides in apprehending the culprit. Despite this, they diligently explored various avenues. At one point, the investigators even turned to clairvoyance, but the outcome was unsurprising. A noteworthy development occurred 15 years after the murder in 1983. The landlord of the apartment where Pamela and Mary resided was convicted of killing his wife. Brooke Atlas, a resident on the first floor directly beneath their apartment, had been a potential suspect from the outset, yet the absence of concrete evidence hindered any definitive conclusions regarding his involvement. Subsequently, he married and relocated to a private residence with his wife. In 1983, their house was engulfed in flames, and forensic analysis swiftly revealed that it was a case of arson. Furthermore, the body of Atlas's wife was discovered in the charred remains, with the cause of death determined to be strangulation. Investigators speculated that financial troubles prompted the man to eliminate his wife and torch the house. Shortly before the incident, he had filed for bankruptcy, and the destruction of his insured property could have led to a substantial insurance payout. However, he was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment for murder and an additional 20 years for arson. The investigators handling Pamela's case found this development intriguing. Atlas, who lived in close proximity to the victim, had the means to commit the crime. He could have utilized a spare key and over time possibly gleaned information about their routines. Despite questioning Atlas, he vehemently denied any involvement. With no incriminating evidence against him, law enforcement had no option but to acknowledge his denial and remain hopeful that fresh leads would surface in due course. Over the ensuing 38 years, no breakthroughs were achieved. Pamela's parents passed away without closure, and among her surviving relatives remained only a younger brother. He had lost all hope of uncovering the truth about his sister's fate, but recently a new opportunity arose. The case was transferred to the Unsolved Homicide Squad, and the fresh team of detectives opted to reinvestigate. Pamela's case was not the typical scenario for such units, as they usually dealt with cases where DNA evidence was left behind by the perpetrator. However, due to the lack of advanced analytical tools in previous years, utilizing DNA evidence to apprehend the killer was impossible. In Pamela's situation, there was a complete absence of evidence, leaving the detectives reliant on luck. They meticulously reviewed all the materials left by their predecessors, including a list of potential suspects. Brooke Atlas emerged as a prominent figure, having previously been incarcerated for his wife's murder. At 79 years old, he was still serving his sentence at the time. The investigators acknowledged the immense challenge of proving his guilt after 53 years, especially considering his advanced age and the unlikelihood of him surviving until sentencing. Pursuing a trial without any evidence would be futile, and no judge would entertain such a case. Consequently, the detectives adopted an unconventional approach. They visited Atlas in prison and proposed a deal: confess to Pamela's murder in exchange for immunity from further punishment. Such actions by law enforcement were exceedingly rare, particularly in cases of heinous crimes. However, in this instance, they recognized only two viable options: waiting indefinitely for new evidence, which was improbable, or securing a confession. Given Atlas's age, the latter option was precarious. Moreover, Pamela's brother, her sole surviving close relative, was also elderly. The detectives felt compelled to reveal the truth to him, informing him of the potential deal, to which he consented. The investigators presented their offer to Atlas and awaited his response. Surprisingly, the strategy proved successful as the perpetrator expressed readiness to confess. The detectives refrained from celebrating hastily. They needed to ensure the man's actual involvement in the murder rather than falsely accusing him. They dedicated numerous hours to interrogating him about the specifics of the crime. Atlas admitted to premeditating Pamela's murder. After waiting for her sister to leave for work, he went to their apartment and rang the doorbell. Upon Pamela's opening the door, he informed her of a supposed leak in one of the apartment's pipes that required urgent repairs. Without hesitation, Pamela allowed him inside. Once inside, he assaulted and strangled her, then transported her body to his apartment and violated her. This was his primary motive. Atlas then placed her in a barrel and took her to the warehouse of the small airport where he worked as a flight instructor. Later that day, just a few hours after the murder, he was calmly conducting flight lessons with his students. The barrel remained in the warehouse for several days, after which Atlas took it to the banks of the Missouri River, dismembered the body, and disposed of it in the water. Additionally, the man disclosed several details to the police that had never been made public, indicating that only the perpetrator could have known them. Armed with this information, the detectives had no doubt that Atlas was telling the truth. 53 years later, they finally managed to solve the case, albeit having to grant the murderer full immunity. Surprisingly, the murderer agreed to the deal, citing his newfound belief in God and feelings of remorse during his time in prison. He apologized to Pamela's relatives for his actions. The analysis by the Detroit psychologist turned out to be quite accurate. Atlas had indeed appeared to be a decent man. He had worked as a heavy equipment operator for a long time, then transitioned to teaching flight lessons and starting a family. It was only after his wife's murder that his true nature was revealed. The victim's brother expressed gratitude to the investigators for bringing the case to a close.